Welcome to part 7 of 8 lectures on the coming 2026 financial and economic crisis. An important part of this picture is the systemic reward to what economists refer to as rent seeking. As income and asset ownership becomes ever more concentrated, so does rent seeking investment activity. That is, speculations that add no new goods or services to the economy but generate inflated asset values far above what is justified by the capitalization of the asset's actual income stream. Treating gains on the sale of financial assets as, quote, capital gains, unquote, for purposes of taxation and other loopholes in our tax system diverts investment of surplus disposable incomes away from the production of tangible capital goods. Actual capital goods, equipment, machinery, buildings, technologies, depreciate rather than appreciate over time. By treating gains on financial assets as capital gains and imposing low rates of taxation, our economy takes on the characteristics of an unregulated gambling casino. Today, the states use investment tax credits to attract and direct investment. They compete with one another in what amounts to a zero-sum game to attract businesses from other states. More appropriately, tax credits are also utilized to stimulate investment in renewable energy and other outcomes deemed to be socially beneficial. As is the case with all such measures, the economic cycle continues because the measures do not address systemic problems. The federal government has its own priorities and uses the same tools in an effort to induce private sector participation. While these programs do achieve some redirection of individual and business investment, as with the installation of solar panels and wind turbines, they too often result in decisions made based on rent-seeking considerations. Again, I note that none of these government programs has in any way softened the fall when the economic cycle reaches its point of accumulated maximum stress. The cost of energy is another increasing stress on our economy and our society. During 2021, the average nominal retail energy price to customers increased by 4.3% over 2020. The cost of producing energy with renewable sources continues to fall. However, at least in the short run, only by changing consumption patterns are households and businesses able to offset the continuing increases in energy costs. And at least for the foreseeable future, we are again having to cope with the significant supply chain disruptions. There have been several dramatic shocks to energy production and delivery, including damage to facilities caused by climate-related natural disasters, and now the attack and invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. The U.S. electrical grid system has proven to be quite vulnerable to outages and vulnerable to the effects of climate change. One important lesson, of course, is that the U.S. has been far too slow in the development of alternative and sustainable sources of energy. Even without consideration of systemic shocks, the issue exists of how long the world's supply of fossil fuels will continue to meet escalating global demand. While experts debate whether we have passed the point of peak oil discovery, the volatile price of oil is changing the economics of exploiting and utilizing this increasingly scarce and environmentally damaging resource. Today, much of the discussion around the need to replace fossil fuels centers on the evidence from climatologists that we have very little time to prevent catastrophic harm to the planet's capacity to support the way most humans now live. We may have already run out of time, although the systemic issues will likely wait until the end of the 2027-2045 cycle to demand an as yet unaccepted global response mandated by an enforceable international agreement negotiated by the world's governments. Outside of the small community of people who have studied Henry George, only the investment community seems to be talking about the fact that the shift to wind turbines and solar farms to produce energy is resulting in huge gains in land value where these technologies have been established. An analyst at Landmark Dividend LLC recently made this comment with regard to wind farms. This rapid expansion of wind farming in the U.S. is creating many financial opportunities for property owners to convert their land into a high-value, money-making asset since energy developers need all the land they can get for their wind farming projects. There are now more than 2,500 utility-scale solar photovoltaic electricity generating facilities in the United States. Between 5 and 10 acres of land is required to construct a viable solar power plant. For the landowner, leasing their land for solar-generated electricity yields a rent from $250 to $2,000 per acre per year. Note that the solar farm shown here does not seem to be located on otherwise marginal land. If the land rents were turned over to the community via taxation, would these solar panels qualify as highest best use of the locations? That's a reasonable question to ask. According to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the entire U.S. could be powered by creating solar-powered plants on just 0.6% of the country's land mass. At the end of 2020, however, solar power provided just 3% of U.S. electricity generation. It is worth noting that also expanding is the number of buildings able to take advantage of new solar technologies to generate sufficient power for their own needs, with a surplus sold to the local power utility. Only about 5,000 net zero energy homes existed in 2019. However, developers are daily adding to the supply. It must be understood that what the nation faces is an almost impossible challenge of meeting energy needs and somehow halting permanent climate instability and the frequency and severity of destructive weather-caused events. Over the next few years, the odds are that several serious climate-related disasters will each year hit some parts of the United States. Depending on how our governments at all levels respond to these challenges, the timing of the next cyclical downturn could be accelerated. Interestingly, despite the above reasons for concern about the immediate future, analysts who monitor and work within the nation's property markets expect demand to be strong and property prices to continue to climb. For example, at the beginning of the current cycle, Virginia Tech urban planning professor Robert Lang forecasted a sustained increase in demand for land to construct new housing, new commercial, and retail space. He wrote, "If you think the real estate boom of the past decade was bounteous, peek a little further over the horizon. Researchers estimate that the massive build-out will constitute a $25 trillion development market by 2030, more than twice the size of the U.S. economy today." However, what Professor Lang and others are failing to consider are the underlying stresses at play. Unless land markets are made to respond in a manner different from the past and the present, the nation's economy is destined for a collapse more severe than what occurred in 2007. Everything we have covered to this point supports this conclusion. Remember that the median price of an existing residential property today is nearly $270,000, double what it was in 1999. A similar increase has not occurred in median household income or savings. Note just how much higher is the median price for a newly constructed property, now around $430,000. Higher mortgage interest rates will reduce property sales and prices in some markets. However, except for newly constructed properties offered by builders, privately owned residential properties are often pulled from the market while owners wait for a seller's market to return. Time for the changes in law, in taxation, and in public policy is running out. How much time we actually have may be less than what the statistics I have presented and the history I have reviewed suggest. British author and economic commentator Fred Harrison has put his finger on the cause of our public policy paralysis. He tells us, the failure to eliminate or control the business cycle, despite repeated attempts to do so, suggests that the received wisdoms do not lead governments to remedies that work. A second reason is that economics, as it is employed today, is seriously prejudiced by the dilution of some of its key concepts. Economists routinely work with economic models that treat the world as if it were composed of two factors, labor and capital, instead of the three-factor model favored by the classical economists. This disembodies the economy from its spatial context, for land is the key piece of the jigsaw that is the complex economy. Fred has been sharing his analysis with the public, with economists, and with government officials for nearly 5 decades, in articles and a dozen books. The sad reality is that few have been willing to listen, and even among those who did listen, fewer still acted on the evidence. The message delivered could not have been clearer. With the correct policies in place, the major social problems that we face in the world today can actually be solved. The way we take resources today actually abuses people and abuses the community. Taxation is based on arbitrariness and abusiveness. It is not based on principle, on the realization that actually we all ought to pay for the benefits that we receive. If we look objectively at our record, we know that long-standing public policies reward behaviors that are detrimental to communities and to the stable economic growth that would employ every person at a living wage. Our laws have been fine-tuned to defend privilege, to make it both possible and extremely profitable to monopolize and control access to what nature freely provides. To tame the boom-to-bust nature of our economic system, the rental value of land in all its forms must be collected by government for the benefit of all citizens. The most basic form of this policy is generally referred to as land value taxation or land value recapture. As I briefly described earlier, I recommend a number of changes in public policy that would move us closer to where Fred Harrison argues we need to go, which is to a system where public revenue comes from the annual rental or leasehold value of land in all its forms. Rents are also derived from ownership of any aspect of nature with an inelastic supply, such as frequencies on the broadcast spectrum or even takeoff and landing slots at airports. The list is actually quite long, including what I list here. So what do we do to move us in the right direction? We already have state and federal income tax systems in place. These need to be restructured to distinguish between income that is earned by producing goods and providing services and income that is derived from passive and speculative investment activities. The changes I recommend combine dramatic simplification with meaningful progressivity. At the federal level, all individual incomes up to the national median should be exempted from taxation. Each state could do the same using the federal figures or the income figures for the state. All other exemptions and deductions would be eliminated. Then, above the exempted amount, increasing rates of taxation would be applied to higher ranges of income. What this change in individual taxation would accomplish is a dramatic shift upward in the direction of unearned rent-derived income flows, while lifting the burden of taxation off of the incomes of those less likely to derive income from the ownership of land or from other rent-seeking privileges. For purposes of illustration, here is a possible rate structure on different ranges of income. Assume as a starting point that the national median individual income is $60,000. Again, the bottom line is that failure to act is not an option. Nothing done to date by government is addressing the fundamental causes of economic depression. The private appropriation of rent has come to absorb such a huge portion of aggregate wealth that no amount of innovation, no amount of productivity enhancements, and no amount of efficiencies in the delivery of either public or private goods and services is capable of overcoming rent-seeking successes. Dramatically changing how governments at all levels raise revenue is the one systemic reform that solves the economic problem. No less a public figure than Winston Churchill, campaigning early in his political career for a seat in the House of Commons, hit the nail on the head. He stated, "Land monopoly is not only monopoly, but it is by far the greatest of monopolies. It is a perpetual monopoly, and it is the mother of all other forms of monopoly." That said, we should understand and accept that the public capture of rents is not a cure-all. There are many other systemic changes needed if we are ever to solve our most challenging social, economic, and political problems. What follows is a brief survey of additional work to be done from my perspective. I think it is worthwhile to spend just a few minutes talking about programs the objective of which is to remove land from the market economy, to eliminate its treatment as a commodity to be bought and sold and used as collateral for borrowing. The idea is to put land into trusts managed for the benefit of an entire community or a targeted segment of a community. The concept behind community land trusts was developed in the 1930s by Ralph Borsodi, a leading decentralist philosopher, activist, and author of the book Flight from the City, published in 1933. In September of 1958, he brought his message to reformers in India. Here is just one brief point in a manifesto for change Borsodi embraced. All the natural resources of the earth, the land, the forests, the oil, the minerals, and the waters are the gift of nature, or nature's God to all humankind. No title to absolute ownership of any part of the earth can be traced back to a deed issued by the creator of the earth. All natural resources are by their nature trustee, not property. Land should be privately possessed, not owned to buy and sell, to be used for incentive to its fullest and most efficient use. But the unearned increment, the ground rent, and the mineral royalties, instead of being privately appropriated, should be used instead of taxes to pay for the necessary services provided by the community. Borsodi's ideas were formalized in the early 1970s in the book The Community Land Trust, A Guide to a New Model for Land Tenure in America, written by Robert Swan and others. The first CLTs were established to help African American farmers in the rural South to gain access to farmland, to work it cooperatively, and to gain secure ownership of whatever improvements they made to the land and any buildings they constructed. My personal experience with community land trusts has been the CLTs created to provide housing that is affordable to low and moderate income households. The trust owns and manages the land. Residents either own their own homes or lease homes or apartments owned by the trust. Ground rent charges are set at a level sufficient to cover any tax obligations and other expenses incurred by the trust rather than by what the market will bear. Restrictions on the resale of the housing unit are established to ensure permanent affordability. It is clear to me that there is an ongoing and increasing need to remove some land from the market to be reserved for socially beneficial purposes. Access to decent, affordable housing is one such purpose. Advocates of fulfilling the social obligation to provide housing to all have embraced the CLT model as far better than, say, public housing, where residents have little or no input in how the property is managed and the community is governed. It is also clear to me that the need to put land in trust would be greatly reduced if anything close to the full potential annual rental value of land was captured to pay for public goods and services. Land prices, economic theory tells us, would fall close to zero, so that housing affordable to lower income households could be constructed without huge public subsidies. And of course, the expectation is that, unburdened by the price of acquiring land, sustained full employment would result in higher wages and good benefits for working people.